Hi students and welcome. This is the Natural and Social History of Cannabis. I'm Sage Fernetovich, the instructor of Cannabis today at HCC, as you probably know. And this is a very short overview of the natural and social history of our plant cannabis. So there is a list of materials and resources on our Moodle page for you to check over, and I will reference them throughout this talk. There is a lot to say on this topic, but we're going to just skim it because the bulk of this course is on cannabis cultivation. We're going to talk about how to grow great cannabis, but to do that, we should look at the broader context of how this plant came to be, why this is an issue, why this is a course dedicated to cannabis. So first, I want to mention that I will discuss cannabis with that name. We could call it anything we want, marijuana, pot, weed, but I like to use the genus name cannabis. Scientists go by genus and species. Cannabis sativa is our plant here. And we can talk about the different strains, sativa, indica, but overall, when I talk in general about marijuana, I will say cannabis. And part of it is because of my scientific background, but also part of it is because the term marijuana is a derivative from the Mexican word for the plant. And in early American history in cannabis, people would use that Mexican language, that Spanish language, to imply their racist stereotypes. So I don't like using the term marijuana because it's not very scientific, and it kind of harkens back to a time where we vilified this plant because of racism. So I kind of just ignore the marijuana term. The native range and spread of cannabis. This is a map showing where cannabis first was discovered in this part of Asia. So we're looking at Pakistan and parts of China here, northern India. And we have found evidence of cannabis here and elsewhere in Asia. And that's kind of our oldest recognized cannabis archaeology. So cannabis spread from this region east into Asia, into the bulk of China and Japan. It spread a little bit north and then went west into Europe in the Middle Ages, and then to South America, and lastly to North America. So there's not a arrow here, but there should be an arrow going up from Mexico up into southern North America to show how cannabis progressed at a very important time in the early 1900s, the late 1800s, when Mexican migrant workers came up to help in the fields during the first time that happened. It still happens today. But this shows the spread of cannabis. Now, in general, our sativa plants tend to like the colder environments, and indica is a more warm weather plant, but there are differences within each strain, but that's a generality. So this is just looking at the bulk of cannabis and how it has spread throughout the world. Years ago, I was told that cannabis was native to North America, and that isn't true, I learned. Cannabis is what's called naturalized in North America, and that means that it was brought to our continent many, many years ago and spread and kind of made itself a natural botanical citizen of our country and our continent. And so that means that it found its place here, it seeded, it did well, and it kept reproducing and did so well that people thought that it was native for a while, but it's really just naturalized. Years ago, like 100 years ago, it was growing kind of wild, and you could look for cannabis, on the side of the road in ditches, and you might find, this weed, and that's what it was. It was just one of the weeds. Actually, I have a book from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's not a very old book, but it's called Weeds of North America, and it's listed in there. And it shows where you would find it, and it's everywhere. But The war on drugs has eliminated our wild cannabis plants, so we really don't find them growing wild very often. Cannabis use has been shown to be a constant throughout history, and we can find evidence of cannabis use from thousands of years ago. There's some evidence of 10,000-year-old cannabis use in Japan. They found material indicating that that happened. And there's evidence of ritual cannabis smoking in China from 2,500 years ago. There's a good reading on Moodle about this. And even Greek writers in our Western history have documented cannabis use 2,000 years ago. So all of this to say that cannabis has been around for a long time and people have recognized its importance and its usefulness for a long time. Here is a piece of art showing cannabis use in India in the 1700s. It was used in India mainly for religious ceremonies and for spiritual people to achieve kind of an enlightened state. And one of the early preparations that people still consume today is called bhang. It's a drink made with cannabis, and you can make bhang lassis, which is a yogurt smoothie with cannabis. There are actually recipes online for that, and they look pretty interesting. I haven't tried it, but it looks good. And so cannabis was used in early India. Of course, we see that cannabis has been used and then demonized by different groups of people over and throughout history. So as soon as it became popular in a spiritual community, it would be taken away and made illegal or criminalized. You see that over and over again for thousands of years. Cannabis is really a product of colonization, where a group of people recognize it, make this plant a centerpiece for certain things in religion or society or medicine, and then another group finds that that group is bad and wants to take away the things that they value, and so makes our cannabis illegal. So that is the sad fact, and it's happened many times all over the world when we look at the history of cannabis. That has happened in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe. It happens in North America. And we're kind of on an upswing of cannabis use right now. It's being decriminalized and made legalized, and that's great, and I hope that continues. In the 1930s, the US criminalized cannabis. And cannabis at that time was introduced most recently by Mexican workers coming up to the US. Of course, there's a variety of histories here and different perspectives, but cannabis use spread from the Mexican migrant workers to other communities of people of color. Cannabis use went from Mexican migrant workers easily into the jazz musicians of New Orleans and the South. So white government lawmakers decided that this was a dangerous thing that people of color were doing and decided to outlaw it. And a lot of the outlawing was a product of Harry Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics. He spread misinformation and racist propaganda to push the ban. They just made stuff up. And it was not fair and horrible. Cannabis was pushed underground, made illegal. Many people of color were imprisoned for cannabis possession and use, and research was stifled. I think this is a really sad part of American history that has led to our perspective of cannabis today, that it is a drug that will make you crazy and its use is completely fringe. It all has to do with what happened in the 1930s. The war on drugs just gained in popularity and kept this momentum going up into the 80s and 90s. And the propaganda continued. People still use it and still use derivatives of the early propaganda to make cannabis fringe plant. So right now we are on a legalization swing. We're seeing a lot of more positive movement in the government, and that's happening in the US and around the world. So keep your eyes on the news. I subscribe to leafly.com, a newsletter. It's an email newsletter, and so that gives a lot of the current events surrounding cannabis use. It's a really interesting thing, and I think the social equity aspect of cannabis is important. So people of color have been imprisoned thousands of times more than people of not color, white people. And this needs to stop. We need to figure out how to solve this huge problem. I think classes like this will help spreading the information. Decriminalization, even though the war on drugs was going on, began in the 1970s. Of course, hippies in the 1960s and 70s were making cannabis more popular, and there was more awareness of what this plant was about. Oregon decriminalized cannabis in 1973, and that was big. Medical cannabis first became legal in California in the mid-90s. And Colorado legalized recreational cannabis in 2012. All of these events were followed by other states slowly, and we're seeing more and more restrictions being lifted on cannabis use. There's a great detailed timeline on Wikipedia, which is right here, a link here. So I will post this PowerPoint separate from this video, so you can click on the link and check that out. Social change regarding cannabis in the 1970s led to a lot of biological change. Now, farmers used something called artificial selection to breed crops, choosing parent plants that have great traits. So we do this for everything: broccoli, lettuce, cauliflower. Hemp plants have been bred for fiber. Those are cannabis plants that have been bred for fiber. And other cannabis plants have been bred for their different effects, whether it's relaxing or stimulating. And in recent years, cannabis has been bred for higher CBD and THC content. So please check out the other materials that I have on our Moodle page. Again, this is a very quick overview of what the social history is about, and it's a good topic, but I want to look at botany next, and then how to grow great cannabis. So please email me with any questions. Thanks.